She showed up in a golf cart like she owned the planet and told me to get off my own land because my tent was lowering property values. I thought it was a prank until she called the cops. On me. For camping. By my lake. With my dog. What started as a peaceful weekend turned into a bizarre HOA turf war, complete with fake signs, hired security, and enough passive-aggressive nonsense to fuel a reality show. If you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA president who thinks she's the sheriff of suburbia, buckle up. This one's for you. Drop a comment if your HOA has ever gone full crazy mode. The trouble started fast. I was setting up my camping chair by the 12-acre lake on my 200-acre Texas ranch when I heard an engine approaching like it was on some kind of urgent mission. A white golf cart came bouncing across the field toward me, and behind the wheel was a woman I'd never seen before. She was dressed in an expensive-looking blazer despite the casual weekend morning, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and she had the kind of expression that suggested she was used to getting her way about everything. As she got closer, Buddy lifted his head and let out a low growl, sensing trouble before I even understood what was happening. The woman parked her golf cart about 15 feet away and climbed out with the confidence of someone who owned the entire state of Texas. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that wealthy people use when they're about to ruin your day. "I'm Selena Thornfield, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, and you need to stop this camping nonsense immediately. This kind of inappropriate activity is completely unacceptable, and it's damaging the aesthetic value of our entire community." I could feel my blood pressure rising as this stranger stood on my family's land and told me what I could and couldn't do. I set down my fishing rod and looked at her with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but this is my property. My family has owned this land for over 60 years, and I have every legal right to camp here." I gestured toward the water where a few ducks were peacefully swimming, completely unaware of the drama unfolding on the shore. Selena's eyes narrowed dangerously and she glanced around the area with obvious distaste, like she was looking at a garbage dump instead of pristine natural beauty. "Your property or not, this camping situation is affecting our community's property values in a very serious way," she said, her voice getting sharper with each word. "My husband owns Matthews Construction Company, and we're looking to develop this entire area into something much more suitable and profitable. You'd be very wise to cooperate with our plans, Mr. Matthews." The way she said cooperate made my skin crawl, because it wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat wrapped in a business suit and delivered with a smile that could freeze hell over. That's when I realized what this was really about, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You think you can just waltz onto my land and tell me what to do?" I said, standing up and taking a step toward her. "This is my home, lady. I don't negotiate with bullies, and I sure as hell don't sell to con artists who think they can intimidate me into giving up my family's legacy." Buddy seemed to sense my escalating anger and moved closer to my legs, his growl becoming more pronounced as he stared at this unwelcome visitor. Selena's smile transformed into something cold and calculating, like a snake deciding whether you were worth the effort of biting. "Mr. Matthews, you clearly don't understand the situation you're in," she said, taking a step closer and lowering her voice to a menacing whisper. "You don't want the entire neighborhood working against you. Trust me when I say that I have very effective ways of making things extremely difficult for people who don't want to be reasonable. Very difficult indeed." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my camping setup, my truck, and even Buddy, like she was gathering evidence for some kind of case against me. "Are you seriously threatening me on my own property?" I asked, my patience finally snapping as I watched her document my perfectly legal activities. "Because if you are, I suggest you get back in that little cart and drive away before this conversation gets a lot less friendly." Selena finished taking her pictures and looked at me with the kind of condescending expression that made me want to throw her golf cart into the lake. "Oh, it's not a threat, Mr. Matthews. It's just that camping activities like this can create so many potential problems. Fire hazards, noise complaints, environmental concerns, safety violations. The list goes on, and my community takes these issues very seriously." The implications of her words were crystal clear, and I felt my hands clench into fists as I realized this woman was essentially declaring war on me for the crime of enjoying my own property. Buddy must have sensed the escalating tension because he stepped forward and barked sharply at Selena, causing her to take a quick step backward toward her golf cart. "You'd better control that animal," she snapped, her composure finally cracking slightly. Aggressive dogs are another community safety concern that we monitor very closely. I reached down to scratch Buddy behind the ears while never taking my eyes off Selena. My dog is protecting his territory from trespassers, just like any smart animal would do. And since this is our territory, I'd say he's got the right idea. Selena climbed back into her golf cart with that same cold smile returning to her face, like she'd accomplished exactly what she came here to do. Mr. Matthews, you can expect to hear from our community board very soon regarding your various violations of area standards and safety protocols, she said as she started the engine. I sincerely hope you'll reconsider your position before this situation becomes more complicated than it needs to be. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you're guaranteed to lose. Lady, you just picked a fight with the wrong person, I called out as she began to drive away. I've been dealing with my land longer than your fancy neighborhood has even existed, and I'm not about to let some wannabe dictator steal what my family built. With that final exchange, she drove away across the field, leaving me and Buddy staring after her in a mixture of rage and determination. I sat down heavily in my camping chair and looked out over the peaceful lake, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for my future. Buddy whined softly and nuzzled my hand, as if he understood that this woman meant serious trouble for both of us. "What do you think, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears while my mind raced with plans. Ready to show this lady what happens when she tries to steal from the wrong family? Buddy's continued growling as he stared in the direction Selena had gone told me everything I needed to know. This was war, and I intended to win it. 3 days after my confrontation with Selena Thornfield, I discovered that she hadn't been making idle threats about making my life difficult. Buddy and I drove out to the lake for our usual evening routine, but as we approached our favorite camping spot, I saw something that made my blood pressure spike instantly. There, planted right at the edge of my lake, like some kind of territorial marker, was a large metal sign that read, "No trespassing, private community property. Violators will be prosecuted." The sign was obviously brand new, still shiny from the hardware store, and it was clearly positioned to make anyone approaching the lake think twice about setting foot near the water. Buddy started barking furiously at the sign before I even had a chance to process what I was seeing, as if he understood instinctively that someone had invaded our territory with hostile intent. I parked my truck and walked over to examine the sign more closely, my hands already clenched into fists with rage. The sign was professionally made and firmly planted with concrete, which meant this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. Selena had planned this invasion carefully, probably ordering the sign the same day she stood here taking pictures of my camping gear. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures of the sign from different angles, documenting the obvious trespass on my property, then grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox and started working on removing it immediately. "This is my land, Buddy," I muttered as I worked on loosening the bolts, my anger growing with each turn of the screwdriver. Nobody plants signs on my property without permission, especially not some wannabe land grabber with delusions of grandeur. But he continued his agitated barking, pacing back and forth like he was ready to attack the offending sign himself. As I was loosening the last bolt, I heard the familiar sound of that golf cart engine again, but this time it was accompanied by the deeper rumble of larger vehicles. I looked up to see Selena approaching, but she wasn't alone, and she clearly wasn't playing games anymore. 2 large men in black suits were walking behind her cart, their hands resting near what looked like holstered weapons, and a third man in an expensive suit was climbing out of a black sedan that had followed them. The intimidation was crystal clear. I wasn't dealing with just one person anymore, and they wanted me to know it. "Mr. Matthews," Selena called out sharply, her voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. "Step away from that sign immediately and cease your vandalism of community property. This lake has now been officially designated as a shared community resource for the Pinewood Estates residents, and you are currently trespassing on restricted land." One of the men in black stepped forward, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal a shoulder holster, while the man in the expensive suit opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of official-looking documents. I stood up slowly, the screwdriver still in my hand, and faced the small army that Selena had brought to intimidate me on my own property. Buddy had positioned himself directly between me and the strangers, his hackles raised and a steady growl rumbling in his throat like a warning engine. "You want to make this a legal matter?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Because I'm not backing down from anyone, especially not on my own land." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my property deed, holding it up so everyone could see it clearly. This legal document shows that I own this land, including this lake and everything around it, I continued, my voice getting stronger as I spoke. This woman has absolutely no authority here, and neither do any of you. That sign she planted is an act of trespassing, and I was removing it from my own property. The men in black looked uncertain for the first time, glancing between me and Selena for guidance on how to proceed. But Selena wasn't about to let facts get in the way of her intimidation campaign. Selena snatched the deed from my hands and barely glanced at it before handing it back like it was worthless paper. Property disputes are a civil matter that will be resolved through proper legal channels, she said dismissively. These security professionals are here to maintain order and safety for our community, and right now, your aggressive behavior and camping activities are disturbing that order significantly. She gestured toward my camping gear like it was evidence of some terrible crime, then looked at her security team with obvious expectation. The larger of the two men in black moved his hand closer to his weapon and stepped toward me with obvious intent to escalate the situation. Sir, you need to pack up your gear and leave the premises immediately, or we'll be forced to take appropriate action to remove you, he said in a voice that suggested he would enjoy the opportunity. The threat was clear, and I could see that Buddy was getting more agitated by the minute, his protective instincts telling him that these strangers meant harm to both of us. Let me be very clear about something, I said, looking each of the men directly in the eye. You're standing on my property, threatening me and my dog, based on the lies of a woman who's trying to steal my land. If any of you so much as touch me or my dog, you're going to find out exactly how seriously Texas takes property rights and self-defense. I grabbed Buddy's collar gently but firmly, more to keep him from escalating the situation than to control him, because I could see he was ready to defend our territory with everything he had. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, I thought things might turn violent right there beside my peaceful lake. Selena stepped between us with a satisfied smile, clearly enjoying the confrontation she had orchestrated and the fear she thought she was creating. Mr. Matthews, you can expect to receive official legal notice from our community board within 24 hours regarding your multiple violations of area guidelines and safety protocols, she announced like she was delivering a court verdict. Continued camping and recreational activities on this disputed property will result in immediate legal action and possible criminal charges. She turned to her security team with the air of a general commanding troops. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Matthews off the premises and ensure that he removes all of his camping equipment immediately. If he refuses to comply, contact local law enforcement for assistance with the trespassing situation. I wanted to argue, to fight, to stand my ground and defend my property rights, but with Buddy's safety potentially at risk and 3 armed men ready to escalate things to violence, I decided that tactical retreat was the smart move. Come on, boy, I said, loading my camping gear back into the truck while maintaining eye contact with each of Selena's hired intimidators. We'll be back, and next time we'll be ready for whatever games they want to play. As I drove away, I could see Selena in my rearview mirror, standing next to her illegal sign, with her arms crossed and that same cold smile on her face. She thought she'd won the first real battle of our war, but she had no idea what she had just unleashed, or how badly she had miscalculated her opponent. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with Buddy riding shotgun, determined to get to the bottom of Selena's claims about my property and uncover whatever scheme she was running. The records office was a dusty, outdated place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, but it contained the ammunition I needed to fight back. I had barely started digging through property records when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A man in a dark suit standing near the entrance, pretending to read a bulletin board, but clearly watching every move I made. When I looked directly at him, he quickly turned away and started walking toward the exit, but not before I got a good look at his face. He was the same type of professional intimidator that Selena had brought to my lake the day before, which meant she was having me followed and monitored. I grabbed Buddy's leash and followed the man outside, but by the time I reached the parking lot, he was climbing into a black sedan with tinted windows. The license plate was partially obscured, but I managed to catch enough digits to write down before he sped away. Back inside, I continued my research with a growing sense of urgency and paranoia, knowing that Selena's people were now aware that I was digging into their operations. Every time someone entered the records office, I looked up to see if it was another one of her watchers. What I discovered in the public records made my stomach turn, with a mixture of anger and disgust, but also gave me hope that Selena had finally picked on the wrong guy and made a crucial mistake. According to the documents, Matthews Construction Company had a disturbing pattern of acquiring properties adjacent to desirable natural features through what could only be described as systematic harassment campaigns. In each case, the previous owners had sold their land for a fraction of its actual value after being subjected to months of legal pressure, false complaints, and intimidation tactics. The pattern was always the same: false claims about property boundaries, frivolous complaints to local authorities, and persistent pressure until the owners gave up and sold out. As I was photocopying the most damaging documents, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was gravelly and threatening, clearly designed to intimidate me into stopping my investigation. "Mr. Matthews, you've been asking a lot of questions about things that don't concern you. Some people might take that the wrong way and decide you need to learn some manners about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Accidents happen to folks who don't know when to mind their own business." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing in the courthouse with Buddy growling softly at my feet, as if he could sense the danger we were walking into. I looked around the records office with new eyes, suddenly aware that I was completely exposed and vulnerable while researching Selena's criminal activities. But instead of scaring me off, the threatening phone call just confirmed that I was onto something big enough to make them nervous, which meant I needed to dig deeper and faster. The most disturbing case I found involved an elderly couple who had owned a beautiful 40-acre property with a small pond. According to the court documents, Selena had convinced their HOA to claim that the pond was a community water feature and had filed multiple nuisance complaints against the couple for maintaining an unsafe water hazard. The harassment went on for 8 months until the elderly owners, both in their 70s, finally sold their land to Matthews Construction for 1/4 of its appraised value. The company had immediately built a luxury development around the pond and marketed it as an exclusive water feature community. Buddy lifted his head and nuzzled my hand as I read through the legal papers, as if he could sense my growing rage and the very real danger we were walking into. The documents showed that Selena had a history of using intimidation tactics, false claims, and legal technicalities to drive people off their land. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was a professional land grabber who used her position as HOA president to legitimize her criminal harassment campaign. The woman was smart, calculated, and absolutely ruthless in pursuit of her goals, with more schemes than a used car salesman and twice the charm of a rattlesnake. But there was one detail that gave me hope and showed me exactly how to beat her at her own game. The elderly couple had initially fought back and had even won a preliminary injunction against the HOA's interference. The problem was that they had run out of money for legal fees and had eventually been forced to settle out of court. The documents showed that Selena's tactics were legally questionable at best, and in some cases, they crossed the line into outright harassment and fraud. If I could prove that she was using the same playbook against me, I might be able to turn the tables on her. As I was leaving the courthouse with my folder full of incriminating evidence, I noticed the same black sedan parked across the street with its engine running. The message was clear. They wanted me to know I was being watched and followed. I made copies of all the relevant documents and headed home with a new understanding of what I was up against and the very real danger I had stumbled into. This wasn't just about my camping trips or even my property rights anymore. Selena was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to steal people's land, and I was her next target. That evening, I sat on my back porch with Buddy at my side, looking out over my land toward the lake in the distance, while constantly checking the shadows for any sign of surveillance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, and every car that drove by made me tense up with anticipation. Selena thought she was dealing with another elderly couple who would fold under pressure, but she had made a crucial mistake. Unlike her previous victims, I knew what she was up to, I had evidence of her crimes, and I had no intention of going quietly into the night. The next week, I spent every spare moment preparing for what I knew would be an all-out war with Selena Thornfield. But I wasn't going to let her intimidation tactics slow me down. My first priority was documentation, so I invested in 4 high-quality security cameras designed for outdoor use. Buddy supervised from the truck as I carefully positioned the cameras around the lake area, making sure they covered every angle while remaining as hidden as possible among the trees and bushes. If Selena wanted to play games on my property, I was going to have video evidence of everything she did. Knowledge is power, but video evidence is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Just as I was finishing the setup of the last camera, Buddy started growling furiously and staring at the tree line with intense focus. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, catching a glimpse of movement that was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone was out there watching me work, probably reporting back to Selena about my security preparations. I called out toward the shadows. "I know you're out there! This is private property, and you're trespassing!" The movement stopped immediately, followed by the sound of someone retreating quickly through the brush. I also arranged for an official boundary survey to be conducted on my property, despite knowing that it would draw even more attention to my activities. The surveyor spent 2 days walking my land with GPS equipment and metal detectors, locating the original property markers that had been placed when my grandfather first bought the ranch. "Your boundaries are crystal clear," he told me as he hammered in new metal stakes to mark the corners of my property. "The stake is smack dab in the middle of your land, and anybody who says different is either lying or stupid." I thanked him for his professional opinion and made sure to get everything in writing. While the survey was being conducted, I spent time researching Texas property law and landowner rights, constantly looking over my shoulder for any sign that I was being watched. I learned that what Selena was doing had a legal name: tortious interference with property rights. I also discovered that Texas has some of the strongest property rights laws in the country, and that landowners have broad authority to defend their property against trespassers and harassment. Turns out the Lone Star State doesn't take kindly to people messing with other folks' land. Buddy proved to be more helpful than I could have imagined during this preparation phase, and his keen senses became my early warning system for trouble. One night around 2 in the morning, Buddy started barking furiously and scratching at the back door like something was seriously wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and followed him outside, where his urgent barking led me straight to the lake area. I felt it too. Something was about to go wrong, and the shadows seemed to be moving with purpose rather than wind. When I checked the security camera footage the next morning, I discovered that 2 people had been walking around the lake with flashlights, clearly scouting the area and testing my security setup. The footage was too dark to identify the individuals, but it was obviously people who knew about my cameras and were trying to stay out of their direct line of sight. The fact that they were on my property in the middle of the night was clear evidence of trespassing, and I saved the footage to my computer as evidence while making plans to upgrade my security even further. My preparation activities were interrupted by an unexpected confrontation that showed me just how far Selena's influence had spread throughout the community. I was at the local hardware store buying additional security equipment when I was approached by 3 men who identified themselves as residents of Pinewood Estates. "You're the guy causing all the trouble with the community lake, aren't you?" the largest one asked, stepping uncomfortably close to me while his friends flanked me on both sides. "Selena told us you've been threatening her and trying to keep families away from the water." I realized that Selena had been spreading lies about me throughout the neighborhood, turning my defensive preparations into evidence of aggressive behavior. "Gentlemen, I think you've been misinformed about the situation," I said, trying to keep my voice calm while mentally calculating my options if this turned physical. "That lake is on my private property, and I have every legal right to control access to it." The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting me to defend myself so confidently, but their body language remained threatening. The confrontation ended without violence, but it drove home the point that Selena was building a community-wide coalition against me, using fear and misinformation to turn neighbors into enemies. I left the hardware store with my security equipment and a new understanding that I wasn't just fighting one woman anymore. I was fighting an entire network of people who believed her lies about me being the villain in this story. That same evening, I received the certified letter that I had been expecting since my first confrontation with Selena. It came from something called the Pinewood Estates Community Standards Board, and the message was clear and threatening. I was being accused of maintaining a public nuisance, operating an unauthorized campground, creating fire hazards in a residential area, and engaging in aggressive behavior toward community representatives. The letter demanded that I cease all camping activities immediately, and warned that failure to comply would result in appropriate legal action. As I finished reading the legal threat, my phone rang with another call from Matthews Construction Company. This time it was a man who claimed to be the company's acquisition specialist, and his offer was much more direct than previous inquiry. "Mr. Matthews, we understand you're having some issues with community relations and we'd like to help you resolve them. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for your property, which is a very fair price considering the current complications. This offer is good for 48 hours, after which the situation might become much more difficult to resolve favorably." The implied threat was unmistakable, and I hung up feeling more determined than ever to fight back with everything I had. 2 weeks after receiving the threatening letter from Selena's community board, I decided it was time to force her hand and end this harassment campaign once and for all. Buddy and I loaded up my camping gear and drove out to the lake just as the sun was setting, deliberately timing our arrival for maximum visibility. I pitched my tent in the exact same spot where Selena had first confronted me, built a small campfire in my designated fire ring, and settled in for what I knew would be the most important evening of this entire war. Buddy seemed to sense the tension and stayed close to my side, his ears perked up and alert for trouble. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 8:37 p.m., I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser coming across the field toward my campsite. Buddy immediately started barking as a warning that strangers were approaching our territory with hostile intent. Behind the police car, I could see the headlights of Selena's golf cart, and I knew she was coming to watch the show she had orchestrated, probably expecting to see me dragged away in handcuffs. Officer Brad Wilson climbed out of his patrol car with the weary expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with another property dispute. Selena parked behind his cruiser and hurried over, her face lit up with satisfaction. Before Wilson could speak, Selena jumped in with her prepared speech. "Officer Wilson, thank you for responding to this emergency. This man has been illegally camping on community property despite repeated warnings, and we're concerned about fire safety violations and continued trespassing." Officer Wilson looked tired as he approached my campsite, but before he could deliver another order to pack up and leave, I stood up and held up my hand. "Officer Wilson, before anyone says anything that might complicate this situation, I need you to look at something very important." I pulled out the folder of documents I had prepared, including my property deed, the official survey results, and legal research. These documents prove beyond any doubt that this is my property, and that I have every legal right to be here. Selena quickly interrupted before Wilson could examine my evidence thoroughly. "Officer, those are just property disputes for civil court. The immediate issue is that this man is creating a fire hazard and disturbing our entire community. We need him removed tonight, before someone gets hurt." She gestured toward my campfire like it was some kind of dangerous explosive device, rather than a small, contained fire in a proper fire ring. Wilson glanced at my papers, but Selena's urgent tone was influencing his decision-making. "Sir, regardless of any property disputes, I've got multiple residents complaining about your activities. I need you to put out that fire and pack up immediately. Property issues need to be resolved through the courts during business hours." The dismissive way he treated my legal documents made my blood boil, but I stayed calm because this was exactly what I had expected and planned for. "Officer Wilson," I said firmly, "what you're asking me to do is leave my own property because someone else doesn't like how I'm using it. That's not how property rights work in Texas." Selena stepped forward with a triumphant smile. "Mr. Matthews, if you don't cooperate with Officer Wilson's lawful instructions, you could be arrested for interfering with police business. I'm sure that's not something you want on your permanent record." That's when I decided to play my trump card and turn this entire situation on its head. I had been recording the whole conversation on my phone, and now it was time to reveal the evidence that would destroy Selena's credibility forever. "Officer Wilson, before you make any decisions based on this woman's lies, I think you should hear something very interesting." I pulled out my phone and pressed play on the recording of Selena's threats and admission that she was trying to force me to sell my property. Selena's voice filled the evening air, crystal clear and incriminating. "My husband owns Matthews Construction Company, and we're looking to develop this entire area into something much more profitable. You'd be very wise to cooperate with our plans. I have very effective ways of making things extremely difficult for people who don't want to be reasonable." The recording continued with her threats about community action and her obvious attempts to intimidate me into selling my family's land. Officer Wilson's expression changed dramatically as he listened, and I could see the moment when he realized that he had been manipulated into harassing a property owner on his own land. But he wagged his tail as if he understood that we had finally scored a major victory. "Miss Thornfield," Wilson said, turning to face Selena with obvious suspicion, "this recording suggests that you've been filing false police reports as part of a scheme to force Mr. Matthews to sell his property. That's a serious crime in Texas." Selena's face went completely white as she realized her scheme was falling apart in real time. "Officer, there must be some mistake. That recording is obviously taken out of context, and Mr. Matthews is using doctored evidence to avoid responsibility for his illegal activities." But Wilson was no longer buying her story, and my evidence was finally having the impact I had hoped for. Wilson examined the survey map, comparing it to information on his phone, and I could see the exact moment when he confirmed that I was telling the truth about my property boundaries. "Ma'am, this official county survey clearly shows that Mr. Matthews owns this property, including the lake. The recording suggests that you've been deliberately filing false police reports to harass him into selling his land. Filing false police reports is a felony in Texas, and harassment of property owners is a serious criminal matter. I played back another recording of Selena's security team threatening me and Buddy on my own property, along with the anonymous phone threats I had received. Wilson's expression grew darker as he listened to the evidence of Selena's systematic harassment campaign. When the recordings ended, he looked at Selena with obvious disgust. "Ma'am, based on this evidence, I have probable cause to believe that you've been engaging in criminal harassment and filing false police reports. Mr. Matthews, I owe you a sincere apology." "Officer Wilson, I appreciate your apology, but I think Miss Thornfield owes me more than that," I said while Buddy barked happily. "She's been systematically harassing me to steal my property, and I have documentation showing she's done this to other landowners. I want to file formal charges for harassment, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Selena stood in stunned silence as her criminal enterprise collapsed around her, finally facing the consequences of her illegal actions. 3 days after Officer Wilson kicked me off my own property, I put my carefully planned counterstrike into motion. I spent Tuesday morning setting up additional security cameras in locations that would capture anyone approaching the lake from any direction, and I made sure each camera was equipped with night vision and motion detection capabilities. Buddy helped by alerting me to the best vantage points, his natural instincts guiding me to spots where intruders would be most likely to approach. By noon, I had complete surveillance coverage of the entire lake area. Wednesday evening, I loaded my truck with camping gear and drove back to the lake, but this time I came prepared for war. Hidden in my camping supplies was a folder containing the official property survey, copies of all relevant Texas property law statutes, documentation of Selena's previous harassment campaigns against other landowners, and most importantly, the recorded conversation from our last encounter. Buddy rode shotgun, his yellow coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, and I could tell he was excited to be heading back to our favorite spot. I pitched my tent in exactly the same location as before and built my campfire in the metal ring that I had installed years ago for safety purposes. As the sun began to set, I sat in my folding chair with Buddy at my feet and waited for the inevitable phone call to the police. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:45 p.m., I saw the familiar flashing lights of Officer Wilson's patrol car approaching across the field, followed by Selena's golf cart and what appeared to be several other vehicles carrying curious neighbors who had come to watch the confrontation. This time, however, I was ready for them. As Officer Wilson approached my campsite, I stood up with my folder of documents in one hand and my phone in the other, making sure to activate the voice recording app. "Good evening, Officer Wilson," I said calmly. "I assume you're here because Miss Thornfield called in another false complaint about my activities on my own property." Buddy moved to my side but remained calm, as if he understood that this was the moment we had been preparing for. Selena climbed out of her golf cart and hurried over, but before she could start talking, I held up my hand to stop her. "Officer Wilson, before anyone says anything else, I need you to look at this official county survey that clearly shows the boundaries of my property." I handed him the survey map with the property lines clearly marked in red ink. "As you can see, this lake is completely surrounded by my land, and I have every legal right to camp here. What Miss Thornfield has been doing is called tortious interference with property rights, and it's a serious crime in Texas." Officer Wilson took the survey and examined it carefully this time, comparing it to a map he pulled up on his phone. I could see the moment when he realized that I was telling the truth and that he had been manipulated into harassing a property owner on his own land. "Miss Thornfield," he said, turning to face Selena, "this survey clearly shows that Mr. Matthews owns this property. Why did you tell me he was trespassing?" Selena's face went pale, and I could see panic starting to creep into her eyes as she realized her scheme was falling apart. "Officer, there must be some mistake," Selena said, her voice beginning to shake. "The community board has documentation showing that this lake is part of our common area. Mr. Matthews is obviously using forged documents to try to confuse the situation." But Officer Wilson was no longer buying her story. He looked at the survey again, then at the metal property markers that were clearly visible in his flashlight beam. "Ma'am, these property markers have been here for decades, and this survey is signed by the county surveyor. Either you've been misinformed about the property boundaries, or you've been deliberately filing false police reports." I pulled out my phone and played back the recording of Selena's threat from our previous encounter, where she had essentially admitted that she was trying to force me to sell my property to her husband's construction company. Officer Wilson's expression grew darker as he listened to Selena's voice describing how she could make things difficult for people who didn't want to cooperate with her plans. When the recording ended, he looked at Selena with obvious disgust. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that filing false police reports is a crime, and harassment of property owners is a serious matter. Mr. Matthews, I owe you an apology." Buddy wagged his tail as if he understood that we had finally won a victory, and I reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Officer Wilson, I appreciate your apology, but I think Miss Thornfield owes me more than that. She's been systematically harassing me in an attempt to steal my property, and I have documentation showing that she's done the same thing to other landowners in this area. I want to file formal charges against her for harassment, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Selena's face went from pale to completely white as she realized that her carefully planned scheme had not only failed, but had actually backfired spectacularly. The crowd of neighbors who had come to watch what they thought would be my humiliation instead witnessed Selena's complete downfall. Officer Wilson spent the next 20 minutes taking my statement and reviewing all of my evidence, while Selena stood there in stunned silence, probably calculating how much this disaster was going to cost her. As the patrol car finally drove away, with Selena in the back seat for questioning, I sat down in my camping chair and looked out over the peaceful lake with Buddy curled up at my feet. The war wasn't over yet, but I had just won the most important battle. The aftermath of Selena's arrest moved faster than I had expected. Within 48 hours, the local newspaper picked up the story, and by the end of the week, I was fielding phone calls from lawyers who specialized in property rights cases. The most interesting call came from an attorney named Demi Thompson, who represented the Henderson family and 2 other landowners who had been victimized by Selena's schemes. "Mr. Matthews," she said, "your case is exactly what we need to bring down this entire operation. Would you be interested in joining a class action lawsuit against Matthews Construction and the Pinewood Estates HOA?" The legal proceedings moved through the courts with surprising speed, largely because my documentation and recordings provided clear evidence of Selena's criminal activities. The county prosecutor charged her with multiple counts of filing false police reports, harassment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Matthews Construction Company was also named in the civil lawsuit, along with the entire Pinewood Estates HOA board that had enabled Selena's harassment campaign. Buddy and I attended every court hearing, and I have to admit that watching Selena try to explain her actions to a judge was more entertaining than cable television. The financial consequences for Selena and her co-conspirators were severe. The civil court awarded me $50,000 in damages for harassment and interference with my property rights, plus legal fees and punitive damages. The other victims received even larger settlements, since they had actually been forced to sell their properties under duress. A sharp attorney who specialized in property rights cases helped coordinate the class action lawsuit, and Matthews Construction Company was forced to pay over $2 million in total damages and was banned from doing business in the county for 5 years. The Pinewood Estates HOA was dissolved entirely, and the residents were left to manage their own properties without Selena's iron-fisted control. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when I was sitting by my lake with Buddy, watching the sunset and enjoying the peace and quiet that we had fought so hard to preserve. A for sale sign had appeared in front of Selena's house the previous week, and I had heard, through the local gossip network, that she and her husband were leaving Texas entirely. The harassment campaign that was supposed to drive me off my land had instead driven the harassers out of the state. Justice had a funny way of working sometimes, and it was even funnier when it came with a $50,000 price tag. Officer Wilson stopped by one afternoon to apologize again and to let me know that the false police reports had been a valuable learning experience for the entire department. "Mr. Matthews," he said, "I want you to know that we've implemented new procedures for handling property disputes. From now on, we'll always verify ownership and boundaries before taking any action on trespassing complaints." Buddy seemed to approve of Officer Wilson's new attitude, actually wagging his tail when the officer reached down to pet him. I guess even my dog could appreciate character growth when he saw it. The best part of the whole experience was that my victory had inspired other property owners in the area to stand up against similar harassment campaigns. Local lawyers were suddenly flooded with cases involving HOA overreach and property rights violations, and the word was spreading that these kinds of bullying tactics would no longer be tolerated in our county. I had accidentally become something of a local hero, though all I had really wanted was the right to camp peacefully on my own land with my dog. Funny how defending yourself can turn you into everyone else's champion. As summer turned to fall, Buddy and I resumed our regular camping trips to the lake, but now we often had company. Some of the former Pinewood Estates residents, freed from Selena's tyrannical HOA rules, had started bringing their families out to enjoy the natural beauty of the area. I didn't mind sharing the peace and tranquility as long as everyone respected the land and understood that this was still my property. The $50,000 in damages had allowed me to make some improvements to the ranch, including a new dock and a proper camping area with facilities for visitors. One evening, as Buddy and I sat by our campfire watching the stars come out over the lake, I reflected on the lessons I had learned from this whole experience. Bullies like Selena Thornfield count on their victims being too intimidated or too isolated to fight back effectively. They use legal-sounding language and official-looking documents to make their harassment seem legitimate, and they prey on people who don't understand their rights or don't have the resources to defend themselves. But when someone stands up to them with proper preparation and determination, their whole scheme falls apart like a house of cards. The story of my fight with the HOA became something of a legend in our part of Texas, and I still get phone calls from property owners who are facing similar harassment campaigns. My advice is always the same: document everything, know your rights, and never let bullies convince you that you're powerless. Sometimes the people who seem most powerful are actually the most vulnerable, because their entire strategy depends on their victims being too afraid to fight back. When that fear disappears, so does their power. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win, and justice isn't just a word in a law book, but a real thing that happens to real people in the real world. Buddy and I are living proof of that, along with a $50,000 bank deposit that says crime doesn't pay, but standing up to criminals sure does.